Today we're going to work with atmospheric effects using watercolor. And the image that I've chosen and that we've chosen is a misty scene with a fence and vegetation in the foreground with some trees in the midground and then a kind of a blended gradated tone in the background. So to start with, I'm going to work with, I'll do a very slight, a very quick drawing using my pencil. And I have some salt in a film canister handy if I want to use texture in the foreground. I have this little spritzer that I can spray water with, mist water. Let's see, I'll use a series of different types of brushes. I have this really big brush I love to use for wetting the paper. If you're going to do a wet in wet technique, it's really fast to use a big flat brush like this. And then I have some other flats that are not quite as large, but they're helpful when it comes to using, especially since there are fence posts in this. I can use a flat brush that's a smaller width for some of those fence posts in the foreground. I also have a big round brush. This is my favorite. It's a number 24 Da Vinci brush, and it's got a good point, so I use it a lot. It saves me time when I work with larger brushes. I have scrubber brush that has an angled end. It's kind of a bristle brush, and it also has this angled edge. Let's see if you can see it if I hold it up against a darker surface, so that you can scrape back into the paint, like maybe in the foreground to create some of the stems of the weeds or the bushes in the foreground. And then I have a number 10 round I like to use. And then usually toward the end, I use a rigger or a liner brush like this. It's a long skinny brush for details. Okay, let's get started. I have a paper towel handy that I can use to wipe up the moisture. In this case, you see I'm using a piece of stretched paper, so I don't have any tape. But I'm going to have to watch along the edges here and maybe use a brush to wick up the paint if it starts to puddle on the edge of my page. Otherwise, I'll get kind of a bleed back with the water and it won't be a very nice effect. I'm not going to, well, maybe I could use a little masking fluid. I'll use a little bit in the foreground. This is a masking fluid pen. It's called a fine line masking fluid pen. And then, of course, I do have some of these micron pens if I decide that I want to create a little more texture or contrast in the foreground. Before I get started, does anybody have questions? Okay, I'm looking at the image and hopefully you have a screenshot of the image. When I post the demo, I will include the image with the painting so that you'll be able to see it. And I'm looking at where the horizon line is here. I'm going to make it about a third of the way down. So I'm just going to draw kind of a light line across. I'm going to check it to see if I've got it fairly even on either side. So in order to do that, I'll take a piece of tracing paper and I'll measure on one side compared to the other side, and then I'll move it over here. Okay, so it's not the same. I have it higher on that side than on this side, so I think I like it a little bit higher. So I'm going to bring this over to this side and move it up a little bit. And check in the center. It doesn't really matter in the center because it's all kind of faded out anyway, but oh, and it looks like on my video it's a little crooked too. So things like horizon lines do matter. Because it's not right. People are going to see that right away. Even people who are not artists will see that and it'll be disturbing to them, like, oh, it's not supposed to slant down. So I have my kneaded eraser. And because I drew the horizon line wrong, I'm going to erase it, but carefully so that I'm not disturbing the paper. I'm kind of using it like a stamp. Okay. I want to soften the line here too, because in the photo, there isn't any kind of a line there. It kind of fades. And I don't really need a lot of drawing here, but I'm going to give myself some indication of foliage. And remember when you're doing foliage that there are little places between the leaves, little holes in places too. So that's something that I want to try to retain. And I'm looking at the placement of the pathway here. And it's a little uneven, a little irregular. It makes it more interesting. It kind of looks like, I guess it's pavement, or almost looks like a boardwalk, but I think it's pavement. And the fence, I like the fence because it's not completely straight everywhere. It's got character. It's been around for a while. Now remember that you're welcome to paint from any of the reference photos or from your own. You do not have to be doing the same one I am unless you want to.
Sylvia, do you want us to be painting while you're doing this as well, or should we just focus on what you're doing?
Some people prefer just to watch and then they can look at the video later. And some people who are probably, want to paint, and because that's what keeps them painting. I know personally that having a class keeps me painting. And so it's really up to you. I don't have any preference. Whatever is working for you is fine with me.
Okay, thanks.
What do you think? What would you like to paint, or do you just want to watch?
Well, I've just had other teachers sort of be adamant about making sure we were watching instead of painting. So I wondered if you had a preference.
No, I certainly don't care. If a person has, I mean, some people have more experience and they don't really need to watch,
Yeah.
So as far as I'm concerned, these classes are here for your use. It's for whatever is working for you. That's the main goal here. Okay, so that's, I know it's a little hard for you to see right now because I didn't draw with a lot of contrast, but it's a basic structure and that's what I need to get started. So I'll start with putting a little bit of masking fluid on some of the foreground flowers and vegetation. I'll do a few lines too. When you use one of these things, you can make thicker areas if you just let it squeeze it out in that one area a little bit more. Okay, let's see, is there anything else I need to preserve? I can also spatter back in later with some gouache, so I won't do very much of this. Okay, so let's see, I don't have a hair dryer handy, but I'm going to start by wetting the top part. And I'll just work on that top section while the masking fluid dries on the lower section. So to start with, I'll go ahead and wet with my big flat brush. I had my paper tilted and I'm going to make it more flat right now. Okay, and now I'll mix up. I'm going to start with a cobalt blue. Even though it's kind of gray and dark in the picture that we're looking at, I want to start with something that is not staining, and cobalt blue is not a staining color. So I'll mix up a fairly decent sized puddle. Some people would have mixed this up ahead of time, but I'm going to let it dry a little bit before I do this. So okay, I'm going to also mix up a little bit of the Aureolin yellow. Which is also a transparent yellow. And then because there's some pinkish tones in there, I'm going to get a little bit of opera going. If you don't have opera, you can use something like rose madder.
Is that ultramarine or cobalt?
Cobalt.
Okay.
Now I'm using this 1-inch flat brush. Actually, I should start with my yellow. My yellow is the lightest. So for that, I put cobalt blue on my brush already. So I'm going to work with my big round brush and start with some yellow down in here. Now I'll come in with my cobalt. So even though I'm going to start with the cobalt, I'm going to also tone it down a little bit and make it more gray. I don't want a lot of green. So I'm being careful about letting it bleed into the yellow. Before it gets to the yellow, I'm going to put some of this. Well, it looks like it got a little bit brighter than I intended it, okay? Got some blue in it, so let me see here. Okay, the idea here is to let this color, I'm tilting my board slightly, let some of it kind of mix on my paper. And I'm taking my spritzer. And it's not a real fine mist like I had hoped it would be, so I ended up with some texture, but it doesn't bother me because I think that it actually does have some texture, so I'm going to just let that happen. Okay. So I'll come back in now with a little bit more yellow. And now I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to my cobalt blue because I want to gray it down slightly toward the top. I think I have to use a little ultramarine actually to make it darker. So I'm taking a brush to get rid of some of this moisture on the edge. Paper towel. And I have some violet on my palette, so I'd like to introduce a little bit of that in here too. And right in here, a little bit of the orange. Okay, now with my paper towel, I'm going to go back into where the tree is and lift a little bit here. And while it's still damp, I want to come back in with some green. And this is
Sylvia, is that a mixed green or a particular shade?
it's sap green, but I think there might be a little bit of this mix that I had on my palette of the ultramarine and burnt sienna in there. It's graded a little bit. In fact, I'm going to try to add some blue to it right now because I don't want it to be too bright as I get down here closer to the horizon. Some ultramarine blue. And while this yellow is still kind of wet, I'm going to pick up some of it with my paper towel because I want it to be a little lighter than it looks right now, as well as some of the pink. I don't want hard edges down here. Okay, with my paper towel, I want to lift up a few lighter areas where the leaves are, so I'm using it as kind of a stamp in places. One of the things I like about this photo is that I see some pinks in there in this area too, and I want to add those, but I don't want them to be too strong. So I'm putting a very diluted pink in here, barely touching the surface. So using the paper towel to blot up where you want the mist to be is very helpful. Okay, now I'm going to come back in with some oranges and greens down in this area here. And what I see in the foreground is a blue or a blue-green, or it's a green that's not quite as bright. So I'm going to mix some blue with my, oh, I'm running out of Viridian. I have to look for my Viridian, but for now I'll use some Hooker's green and add some blue to it.
I have a slight color question. Viridian looks to me about the same color as phthalo green. And is Viridian easier to lift? I was wondering, why people would have both.
Well, Viridian is very transparent. I know that.
Okay,
A lot about phthalo. What do you
And
think?
it is easier to lift.
I know
It
it's
is easier to lift.
Okay,
Phthalo green is intensely staining.
well, I know that. I was just sort of wondering, it almost seems like a duplication, except for that one quality. I didn't know.
That's an important quality.
Yes, of course. But I mean, that almost makes me think, okay, no phthalo. But I don't know.
Well, it's hard to get a real intense color with Viridian. So
Is it?
you want more intensity, then that's when you would probably want to use the phthalo.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to sprinkle a little salt on here in the foreground.
And you can get really intense, I mean, very light tints with the phthalo. So you have a really extended chromatic or value range. But color-wise, they're very similar, I think. Both of them very close to a true green.
It's interesting.
Middle of the road.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's so much difference as well as similarity. It's fascinating.
Yep. I avoid phthalo green, but personal preference. So. But it's useful as a mixing color also. And there are other watercolorists that say the same thing. It's a problematic color because it's so powerful in its tinting strength. But in terms of combining with other colors, it can be very useful.
I'm coming back in here now with a little bit of a reddish tone in areas where I see on the edge of this path, I see kind of a reddish tone. So I'm using it to kind of make a border for the pathway in places. It's not sure if it's Scarlet Lake or it's a warm red anyway. So far, most of my mixing has been on the paper, not so much on my palette. And that's okay, you know, because of the wetness. But here I'm using a little dabs and leaving white of the paper showing through because I want to show more texture in the foreground. A little more salt. Okay, I see more intensity and color in some places in my photo, and I like to add a little more, so I'm going to try it with a little bit of color more here on my brush. I'm just have my brush on the side, and I'm trying to skim over the surface to create a blend that way. And now I have a little bit of violet here I'm coming back in with. Okay, I'm losing some of my little peepholes between the leaves, so I've got to come back in and pick some of that up here. All right, I'm getting ready now to start painting the fence posts. See how dry it is. It's pretty good. So here's my flat brush. It's a 1/4 inch, I believe. And I'm going to mix up a tone that's a kind of a violet tone for the fence posts in the distance. Going to add some burnt sienna now as it gets closer to the foreground. And got to get a little darker here in the foreground, so a little more ultramarine blue in it. Anywhere where it's bleeding out too much, use your paper towel to lift. I'm going to wait for it to dry a little bit more. While I'm waiting, I'll do some painting of the pathway in the foreground. And for that, I'm going to use a horizontal stroke.
I love that mist effect in front of the tree.
Yeah, it's starting to look the way I'd hoped. Actually, it's starting to dry a hard edge, so I'm glad you had me look at it right now. You have to control those edges, you know, when they start to dry a hard edge, you can just use your paper towel to soften it. I'm adding a little bit of a violet to my pathway. So in the distance, I still want the pathway to show, but I have to get lighter with it as it comes back here in the distance. Okay, I'm switching to this round brush now. Using kind of a violet. I have a lot of colors going on in this foreground, but that's what makes it exciting for me to paint it. Getting the fence posts in the foreground darker. How are you guys doing? Are you painting?
Watching.
What?
Okay.
Mesmerized with your painting.
Oh, I may have to go and get my hair dryer. You know how I hate the sound of things like that, but sometimes it's necessary. Okay, so want a little more of the sap green in places.
Well, the gardeners outside my window had the leaf blowers going here 10 minutes ago.
Oh, you must have muted yourself.
I did, yeah. There were two of them.
Oh no, I hate those things.
I do too.
What I wonder is where do they blow them to? Do they actually put them in the trash or are they just blowing around?
No, from here to there.
Yeah,
Yes,
well, they
was,
did. They were being pretty good about it, but I was noticing they were blowing the ground really well, but they were blowing all this dust onto the cars. They weren't blowing the dust off the cars, so,
Oh, great.
yeah.
Oh, yesterday was Bob Dylan's 80th birthday, so it was appropriate that they'd be blowing in the wind.
Oh,
Oh,
right.
good. Thank you, Ron. I can't mute you, unfortunately.
You don't want to, do you?
No, of course not.
Okay, well, I can still, let's see if it's dry enough. I need to put in some of these railings. I'm waiting until it's a little bit more dry, but I'm going to try now, so. Okay.
Sylvia,
Yes,
yeah, I've been watching and how did you get that foggy effect again?
I sprayed water back there and I kind of tilted my board so that the paint would run together.
Uh-huh.
Pretty much
Uh,
that.
and do you smudge it with like that or?
Sometimes I did. If I saw that a hard edge was starting to form, I would take my paper towel
Uh-huh.
and lift it so it would soften that edge, so it wouldn't allow it to make a hard edge.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I have some areas here that got really, well, I guess they're fuzzy in the photo too. Okay, I can see my pencil lines here. So I'm gonna have to paint something there just to soften that slightly. Now I'm going back in and looking at edges and looking to see if I need to darken anything. Because it's still pretty wet in places, I have to be careful. Okay, I might try to get a little texture in some of these in the foreground, even though there isn't much. Let's see what happens if I. Try to get some lines here. Still too wet. Okay, I'm going to go and get my hair dryer. And I'll mute it so that when I have the hair dryer going, it won't be as disturbing. Okay, so now I'm going to take a look because I got away from it for a few minutes. I'm going to now take a look at the image and see if I want to make any other adjustments before I do the final details. In the photo, I see more pink. I could do a little bit of a glaze, like for instance, in this area over here, I just have white. So I might do a little bit of a pinkish glaze there, just to give it that a little more of a glow. So coming in here with no, it's looking a little gray compared to the pink I thought I was going to get. So let me try this again. Okay. Now I'm going to lift some of the frisket. I can feel where it is if I touch the surface. Still a little wet over here, so I don't dare do it there. Now I'm going to take my liner brush and put in a few touches of a brighter color in places. So a cadmium orange. Let's see, some red stalks. Kind of a silhouette of some weeds here in the foreground. And some lines across here. A bit darker, once again, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Now this is what's called negative space painting, where I'm kind of painting some shapes to create a few areas of separation. Okay, and then how about a little bit of spatter? So in order to do that, I need to protect the part of the painting that I don't want spatter in. I'm gonna mix up a dark. Kind of a brownish tone. Now the violet. Okay. Looking at my fence posts, I see that some of them are not very square on the top, so just especially the ones in the foreground, I want to make those a little more square. Okay, now before I call it quits, I want to ask you if there are some things that you observe that you think I should change. Is there any particular area that's bothering you?
I just had a question about the white left on the left side of the path.
Over here, right here?
Yeah,
Yeah, it looks like it maybe takes up your attention just a little too much.
yeah.
So let me put a little tone in there.
And maybe also in the far left corner.
Right over here.
Yeah,
Yeah, good point. I've talked about the corners before in classes that, you know, when you come to the point where you're going to match your painting or you're going to get it ready to show, it's nice if you have the corners more well defined.
yeah, my eye's not going there now.
Yeah, good. And then there's this area that got really soft. That bothers me, that it looks like it got kind of washed out. See right here? So I'll come back in and define some stalks. All right, this looks too bright to me. Do you see that? So
Yeah.
let's see if I can lift it a little by wetting it. Okay, I might have to tone it down here with some violet. No. And then the last resort is gouache. Break it up a little bit here. Now I'm looking for places where I think I need to add a little bit more texture. Okay, I think that'll do it. This
That
will-
looks fabulous,
this part-
Sylvia.
Well, what about over here, though? Do you think I need to add another part of a post or something here?
No,
No.
Okay. All right, I will resist.
you're allowed.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'll stop this for now and we'll go to the voice thread.
That was a great demonstration. Thank you.
Thank you.